Hello, welcome to Return to Life. Today, we will listen to a story about the cracks in life where people have felt weak, full of doubt, yet kept moving forward. If you are standing between exhaustion and hope, this story may be for you.
It was well past midnight when Sarah noticed the towel around David's neck. The house was quiet, in the way suburban homes always were at night. No traffic, no voices, only the low hum of the refrigerator drifting from the kitchen. David sat on the edge of the couch, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He hadn't turned on the TV. He hadn't said much for the past hour. Sarah had seen that posture before. It was the way he sat when something hurt, but not badly enough, at least not yet, for him to admit it. "Let me see," she said softly. David hesitated. The words coming too quickly, too practiced. "Just a bump," she didn't argue. She walked to the hallway, picked up her phone, and turned on the flashlight. When she came back, David sighed and lowered his head, exposing the back of his neck. Sarah gently loosened the towel. At first, all she saw was redness. Then her light caught the shape of it. The swelling sat just below his hairline, centered at the base of his neck. It wasn't flat, it wasn't diffuse. It rose from the skin in a slow, deliberate curve, like something underneath was pushing upward and refusing to spread out. The skin over it was tight and shiny, stretched so smooth it reflected the beam of her phone. The color was deeper than a normal irritation, dark red around the edges with a muted purplish tone gathering at the center, as if pressure were pooling there. Sarah moved the light slightly, looking at it from the side. That was when she felt her stomach tighten. From that angle the swelling was unmistakable. It arched outward in a firm dome, rounded and solid, not soft or sagging. It looked less like a pimple and more like a hard shell forming under the skin, smooth, curved, and unnaturally raised, almost like a small turtle shell pushing its way up from beneath the surface. She didn't touch it right away. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. David shrugged, still looking down. "Couple days, maybe 3. It looks bigger than yesterday." He gave a short laugh. "You're imagining things." Sarah finally pressed her fingers gently against the skin beside it. The surrounding area felt warm, noticeably warmer than the rest of his neck. When she applied even the slightest pressure closer to the center, David flinched. "Hey," he muttered. "Careful." "It's hot," she said. "Well, yeah, it's irritated." She pulled her hand back and studied it again. The swelling didn't move under her touch. It didn't compress or flatten the way a surface blemish usually did. It held its shape, firm and stubborn, like it had decided where it was going to be and wasn't planning to leave. David reached up and retied the towel around his neck. "See?" he said. "It's fine." Sarah didn't answer right away. She had learned, over years of marriage, that David didn't respond well to concern. That sounded like panic. He handled pain by minimizing it, by shrinking it down until it fit inside a sentence like "I've had worse," or "it'll pass." He wasn't reckless. He wasn't careless. He just believed, deeply, that most problems sorted themselves out if you gave them time. But standing there in the dim light of the living room, Sarah felt something she couldn't explain. Not fear exactly, more like a quiet alarm that didn't know what it was warning her about yet. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Only if I turn my head too fast," David said, "or lean back. And when you're not moving, it's just there." She nodded, though she didn't like the answer. The thing that bothered her most wasn't the size of it. It was the way it looked contained, like whatever was happening wasn't spreading out across the skin, but gathering inward, building pressure beneath the surface. She turned off the flashlight. "Maybe you should get it checked," she said, keeping her voice light. David let out a slow breath. "It's not an emergency, Sarah. I didn't say it was. I'll deal with it in the morning." They stood there for a moment, neither of them moving. Finally, David straightened up and walked toward the bedroom, already done with the conversation. Sarah remained in the living room, staring at the dark space where he'd been sitting. She told herself she was overreacting. People got bumps and boils all the time. They healed. They went away. There was no reason to think this was anything different. Still, as she turned off the lights and followed David down the hallway, one thought refused to leave her. The most dangerous problems, she knew, were rarely the ones that announced themselves loudly. They were the ones that looked ordinary, right up until they weren't. David Miller had never thought of himself as careless. In fact, if anyone had asked him, he would have said the opposite. Careless was the guy who skipped work, who drank too much, who ignored his family. Careless was someone who didn't show up. David showed up every day. He showed up early, stayed late, and did what needed to be done without complaining. At 42, his body carried the quiet evidence of a life spent working more than resting. His hands were thick, the skin roughened in places that never quite healed smooth again. His shoulders stayed tense even when he slept. Pain to him was not a warning. It was background noise. He worked long hours, the kind that left him too tired to think deeply about small discomforts. If something hurt but didn't stop him from working, it didn't earn much attention. That was how he'd always lived. You pushed through, you dealt with it later. Hospitals made him uneasy, not because he was afraid of bad news, but because he didn't trust places that turned ordinary problems into long conversations and expensive bills. He had grown up watching men in his family avoid doctors unless something was truly broken. Bones were worth a visit. Blood that wouldn't stop was worth a visit. Everything else you handled yourself. That mindset had served him well for decades. David wasn't reckless with money either. He and Sarah ran a tight household, not because they were struggling, but because they believed in not wasting things that still worked. Towels went into the wash when they were dirty, not after every use. Razors were shared sometimes, left on the bathroom counter without much thought. In David's mind, clean was clean, soap was soap. He didn't see the point in overcomplicating it. Their home was tidy, the floors were vacuumed regularly, the bathroom was wiped down every few days. This wasn't a place where germs thrived, or so he believed. That belief came from experience. He rarely got sick. When he did, it passed. His immune system, he liked to think, was strong, built from years of exposure and endurance. He trusted it the way some men trusted luck. Sarah worried more than he did. She noticed things he didn't, changes in color, small signs that something wasn't quite right. David teased her for it sometimes, gently, the way husbands do when they don't want to admit that their wives might be right. "You think too much," he would say. What he really meant was, "I don't want to think about it." When the soreness behind his neck had first appeared, it barely registered. A tightness, a dull pressure when he leaned back against the headrest of his truck. He assumed it came from sweat, friction, maybe an ingrown hair, the kind of thing that happened all the time and resolved itself just as quietly. He didn't mention it at first. By the time he did, it was already part of the background, something he'd mentally categorized as annoying, not dangerous. That category was large. It included sore knees, stiff fingers, headaches that faded after coffee. It did not include emergencies. In David's world, emergencies announced themselves loudly. They knocked you down. They forced you to stop. This didn't do that. Even as the swelling grew firmer beneath his skin, even as the shape changed from something vague into something more defined, his instincts told him the same thing they always had. You're fine. You've had worse. That confidence wasn't arrogance. It was familiarity. He had lived inside his body for over 4 decades. He believed he knew its language. When it whispered instead of screamed, he assumed it wasn't saying anything important. What David didn't understand, and had never needed to understand before, was that some problems don't follow the rules he'd learned. Some don't spread out or burn brightly. Some settle in quietly, gather themselves, and grow stronger in the space created by neglect. As he went about his days, working, driving, showering, shaving, the routines of his life continued uninterrupted. Nothing felt urgent enough to interrupt them. The swelling behind his neck came with him, unseen by most, tucked beneath his collar like a secret that didn't yet demand to be told. If you had asked David that week whether something was wrong, he would have shrugged. If you had told him that small habits, things he'd done the same way for years, could put the people he loved at risk, he would have laughed politely and changed the subject. Not because he didn't care, but because the idea didn't fit the story he believed about himself. Saturday mornings followed a rhythm David had repeated for years. He woke early, drank his coffee standing at the kitchen counter, and headed out before the rest of the neighborhood fully came alive. The barber shop sat on the corner of a small strip mall, wedged between a dry cleaner and a hardware store. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. The same chairs, the same mirrors, the same faces behind the counter. That familiarity was why David liked it. When he walked in, the bell over the door chimed softly. The barber glanced up and nodded, already reaching for a cape. No questions, no small talk about styles. They both knew what was coming. "Same as always," David said. "Got you," the barber replied. David settled into the chair and relaxed, letting his shoulders drop as the clippers buzzed to life. He trusted this place. He had trusted it for years. Nothing bad had ever come from it, and in David's mind, that history mattered more than anything else. The haircut moved quickly. The barber worked with efficiency, trimming, blending, cleaning the edges with practiced ease. When it came time to clean up the neckline, the barber switched tools. A straight razor appeared in his hand, wiped once against a cloth, then held at a familiar angle. David barely noticed. The razor traced the line at the back of his neck, scraping gently along the hairline. There was a brief sting, sharp but small. David winced, then dismissed it immediately. He'd felt worse paper cuts. The barber dabbed the area with a towel, pressed lightly, and continued. No blood, no drama, just another clean line in the mirror. David paid, thanked him, and left. By the time he reached his truck, the sting had faded into nothing. The back of his neck felt tight, but that wasn't unusual after a close shave. He rolled his shoulders, started the engine, and drove on with his day. What David didn't know, what no one in that barbershop paused to think about, was how vulnerable that small stretch of skin really was. The skin at the base of the neck is thin. It bends and stretches constantly. It holds countless hair follicles, sweat glands, and tiny openings that are invisible unless you're looking for them. A minor break there doesn't announce itself with blood or pain. It simply opens. A door doesn't need to be wide to be useful. It only needs to exist. Later that afternoon, David showered. The hot water beat down on his shoulders, steam filling the bathroom. He scrubbed his neck without thinking, fingers passing over the freshly shaved skin. It felt sensitive, but clean. Whatever irritation had been there seemed unimportant. He dried off with the towel hanging closest to the shower, one the whole family used interchangeably. He rubbed the back of his neck, brisk and absent-minded, then tossed the towel back onto the rack. By evening, there was a faint soreness again. Not pain, just awareness. The sense that something had been touched recently and hadn't quite settled yet. David scratched at it once, then forgot about it. This was how things happened. Not in dramatic moments, not with alarms or warnings, but in the quiet overlap of habits. A place he trusted. A tool he'd seen 1,000 times, a motion repeated without thought. There was no single mistake large enough to stand out. Only a series of small ones that fit neatly into a normal day. When Sarah asked how his haircut turned out, David smiled. "Fine," he said. "Same as always." He didn't mention the sting. He didn't mention the tightness. There was nothing to mention. That night, as he lay in bed, the back of his neck pressed into the pillow. The contact brought a dull pressure, deep and unfamiliar. David shifted slightly until it eased. He fell asleep believing what he always had, that if something didn't demand attention, it didn't deserve it. The first time David really paid attention to it was in the shower. The water was hot, almost too hot, the kind he liked after a long week. Steam fogged the mirror as he worked soap through his hair, fingers moving automatically, thoughtlessly. When his hand slid down the back of his head and across his neck, it paused. There it was. Not pain, at least not yet, but resistance. His fingers didn't glide over smooth skin. They met something solid beneath the surface, something that hadn't been there before. David tilted his head slightly and pressed again. The swelling felt different from a typical pimple. It wasn't soft. It didn't shift away from his touch. It felt anchored, like a knot tied under the skin. He leaned closer to the mirror, wiping a clear patch in the fog. From this angle, he could see it better. The skin was taut, shiny, stretched over a rounded rise. The color was deeper now, red edging towards something darker in the center. "Damn," he muttered. In David's mind, this was still manageable. Things like this always were. You dealt with them early, before they became a problem. He had handled splinters, cuts, ingrown hairs. This didn't feel any different. He pressed his thumb and forefinger to either side of the swelling. At first, nothing happened. The shape didn't collapse or give way. It held, firm and unmoving, like it was resisting him. He increased the pressure, jaw tightening. A sharp, unpleasant sensation shot outward, not across the skin, but deeper, an ache that seemed to come from underneath, spreading in a dull wave. Then, finally, there was release. A small amount of thick fluid surfaced, followed by a trace of blood. David exhaled, a mix of relief and irritation. That was it, he told himself. That was what had been building. He rinsed his hand under the spray and looked again. The swelling was still there. It hadn't flattened the way he expected. The dome remained, its shape unchanged, as if whatever pressure he'd released had only made room for something else. The skin looked angrier now, flushed and tight, the surface gleaming under the bathroom light. David frowned. He pressed again, harder this time, but the resistance only increased. The pain deepened, no longer sharp but heavy, spreading outward in a way that made his stomach tighten. "Enough," he said aloud. He stepped back, letting the water run over his neck. The sensation didn't soothe it. If anything, the heat seemed to make the area throb more insistently. When he shut off the water, he reached for the towel hanging closest to the shower. He rubbed his hair dry, then his neck, more roughly than necessary, trying to chase away the lingering discomfort. The towel absorbed the moisture and whatever else came with it, before being tossed back onto the rack. He didn't think about that. By the time he got dressed, the initial relief had faded. In its place was a strange awareness, like his body was reminding him, quietly but persistently, that something was still wrong. The swelling felt fuller now, more present, as if it had claimed more space beneath his skin. Throughout the day, David found himself adjusting his collar, rolling his shoulders, shifting his head to avoid certain angles. Each movement brought a subtle reminder of the shape at the base of his neck. When he leaned back in his chair, the pressure returned. When he turned too quickly, a dull ache followed. Still, he said nothing. When Sarah noticed him rubbing his neck that evening, she frowned. "Is it bothering you more?" "It's fine," he replied. "I took care of it." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. That night, as David lay in bed, he reached back and felt the swelling again. In the quiet darkness, without the mirror or the water or the distraction of the day, the difference was unmistakable. The shape was more defined now. It rose from his skin in a smooth, rounded curve, firm beneath his fingertips. It didn't feel like something on the surface anymore. It felt like something growing underneath, pushing upward, maintaining its form no matter how he pressed. Like a shell. The thought made him uncomfortable, and he pushed it away as quickly as it came. He shifted onto his side until the pressure eased and stared at the wall, listening to Sarah's breathing even out beside him. He told himself he'd keep an eye on it, that he'd give it another day or two, that these things took time. What he didn't realize was that, in trying to fix it himself, he hadn't solved the problem. He had given it room. Sarah noticed the changes before David ever mentioned them. It wasn't just the way he rubbed the back of his neck more often, or how he adjusted his collar when he thought she wasn't looking. It was the quiet things. The way he turned his head carefully, as if testing limits. The way he leaned forward instead of resting against the couch. The way his patience thinned in small, almost invisible ways. She asked once casually, "Does it still hurt?" David didn't look up from his plate. "Not really." That answer bothered her more than a complaint would have. Sarah had spent enough time around illness to know that pain didn't always announce itself honestly. People, especially men, learned early how to downplay it, how to translate discomfort into something manageable, something that didn't require help. But what she saw on David's neck wasn't manageable. When he bent forward one evening to tie his shoes, the collar of his shirt shifted. Sarah caught a glimpse of the swelling before he straightened again. It was larger now, more defined, the curve more pronounced, rising beneath the skin with a firmness that made her chest tighten. "David," she said, "let me look at it again." He hesitated, then sighed. "You already did. I know. Just, please." He turned reluctantly, lowering his head just enough for her to see. Sarah didn't need a flashlight this time. The light from the kitchen was enough. The skin over the swelling looked stretched thin, glossy in a way that made it seem almost fragile. The color had deepened, red giving way to something darker at the center. The shape was unmistakable now. A rounded dome, solid and contained, like a hard form pressing upward from beneath the skin. She reached out, then stopped herself. "Did you mess with it?" she asked. David shrugged. "I took care of it." "What does that mean?" "I squeezed it. It's fine. It doesn't look fine." He straightened, irritation flashing briefly across his face. "It's a boil, Sarah. People get them. People also get infections. That's not what this is. How do you know?" "Because I've seen this before," he wanted to say. "Because I've handled worse. Because admitting otherwise meant admitting he might be wrong." Instead, he said nothing. Sarah stepped back, folding her arms across her chest. She felt the familiar frustration rising, the kind that came from seeing danger before it could be proven, from knowing something was off but not having the right words to make someone else see it too. "You should go to urgent care," she said quietly. David shook his head. "It's not that serious." "You don't know that, and you do?" "I know it's getting bigger," she said. "I know it's hard. I know it's hot. Those aren't good signs. He waved a hand dismissively. You're worrying yourself for nothing. The words landed harder than he intended. Sarah turned away, busying herself at the counter. She didn't want to argue. Arguments didn't change David's mind. They just made him dig in deeper. But as she rinsed a dish that was already clean, her thoughts spiraled. She thought about the towel he'd used that morning, hanging back on the rack. She thought about the way Ethan had hugged his father that afternoon, pressing his cheek against David's shoulder. She thought about how easily things moved through a household. Not dramatically, not visibly, but quietly, through shared spaces and shared habits. Just keep an eye on it, she said finally. I am, David replied. But watching wasn't the same as acting, and they both knew it. That night, Sarah lay awake longer than usual. David slept beside her, his breathing steady. Every so often he shifted, careful even in sleep to avoid pressure on the back of his neck. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the image of the swelling in her mind. The way it held its shape, the way it didn't behave like something superficial. She remembered a phrase she'd heard once. Deep infections don't always spread outward, they build inward. The thought unsettled her. In the morning, she watched David grab a towel from the rack, the same one he'd used the night before. She almost said something, almost stopped him. Instead, she stayed quiet. There was a fine line between concern and control, and she'd learned long ago that crossing it too forcefully only pushed people away. Still, the silence weighed on her. Later that day, as she folded laundry, Sarah found herself holding one of David's shirts. The collar was stiff with dried sweat. She paused, imagining the skin beneath it, irritated and stretched, harboring something neither of them could see clearly yet. She wondered how many times people ignored warning signs simply because they didn't fit the story they told themselves about who they were. Strong, healthy, capable. She wondered how many problems grew in that gap. When David came home that evening, she studied his face. He looked tired, more tired than usual. There was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Does it hurt? She asked again. He hesitated this time, just for a second. Yeah, he admitted. A little. Sarah nodded, her heart sinking. Sometimes, she thought, being right didn't feel like a victory at all. Over the next few days, it didn't get better, it didn't shrink, it didn't soften, it didn't settle into anything familiar. Instead, it seemed to decide on a shape, and then commit to it. David noticed it first in the mornings, when he rolled out of bed and straightened up. There was a brief second where his neck protested, a deep, dull resistance that made him pause. Not sharp pain, not the kind that made you gasp, the kind that made you move carefully without realizing you were doing it. By midweek, the swelling had become impossible to ignore. It no longer felt like something sitting on the surface of his skin. It felt embedded, anchored. When David reached back to touch it, his fingers traced a smooth curve rising from his neck, firm beneath the skin, holding its shape no matter how he pressed around it. From the side, in the bathroom mirror, it looked worse. The bulge pushed outward in a rounded arc, the skin stretched tight and glossy, reflecting the overhead light. The color had deepened further, dark red along the edges, with a muted purple tone gathering at the center, like pressure building with nowhere to go. It reminded him uncomfortably of a shell, not jagged, not misshapen, just solid, protective, as if whatever was inside had wrapped itself up and decided to stay. The area was hot now, not warm, hot. When Sarah brushed her hand near it while passing behind him, she pulled back instinctively. That's really warm, she said. David nodded but didn't respond. Sleep became difficult. Lying flat pressed the swelling into the pillow, sending a heavy ache down into his shoulders. Turning his head too quickly sparked a wave of pain that radiated outward, not across the skin but deep beneath it, like the source sat out of reach. At work, he caught himself rolling his neck less. He leaned forward when he sat, avoiding contact with chair backs. His temper shortened. Small frustrations felt larger than they should have. By Thursday, his collar bore faint yellowish stains. By the end of the day, David noticed them when he undressed that night, frowning as he held the shirt up to the light. There was a faint, unpleasant odor he couldn't quite place. He told himself it was sweat. In the shower, he avoided touching the area directly. The last time he'd tried, the pain had surprised him. Not sharp, but deep and spreading, like pressure pushing outward from a central point. The hot water didn't soothe it anymore. It seemed to make it throb. When he dried off, he reached automatically for the towel on the rack. He hesitated for half a second, then used it anyway. Old habits didn't break easily, especially when nothing looked dramatic enough to demand change. Sarah watched all of this with growing unease. She noticed how David's movements had changed, how his body adjusted itself subtly to protect the back of his neck. She noticed the way he rubbed the area absent-mindedly when he thought no one was watching, then stopped abruptly, as if reminded that touching it didn't help. One evening, as he leaned forward to pick something up, the collar of his shirt slipped again. Sarah caught a full view this time. It was bigger, not wider but higher. The swelling had pushed upward, maintaining its rounded dome-like form. The skin over it looked almost too tight, as if stretched to its limit. The center had darkened further, the color deep and bruised, standing out starkly against his skin. Her breath caught. "That's not normal," she said. David straightened slowly. "It's just inflamed. It looks like it's under pressure." He didn't answer. What bothered Sarah most was how contained it looked. Infections she'd seen before often spread outward, reddening the surrounding skin. This one didn't. It held itself together, compact and firm, like something sealed beneath the surface. That night, David developed a low-grade fever. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make him feel off. Slightly chilled one moment, flushed the next. He took some over-the-counter pain relievers and went to bed early. The next morning, the swelling was unchanged. If anything, it felt heavier. When David pressed his fingers along the edges, the shape remained stubbornly intact. It didn't flatten, it didn't shift. It felt like a solid mass under the skin, the kind that didn't belong there. He caught his reflection again, turning his head slowly from side to side. The bulge was visible now even from a distance. It distorted the clean line of his neck, creating an asymmetry that drew the eye whether he wanted it to or not. For the first time, a thought surfaced that he didn't immediately dismiss. This isn't acting like a boil. The realization made his stomach tighten. At dinner that night, he barely touched his food. Ethan chattered about school, oblivious, while Sarah watched David closely. When Ethan reached up and hugged his father from behind, pressing his cheek briefly against David's shoulder, Sarah felt a flash of fear she didn't fully understand. "Careful," David said gently, shifting away. Ethan looked up, confused. "Did I hurt you?" "No," David replied. "Just be careful." After Ethan went to bed, Sarah finally spoke again. "This is getting worse," she said. David nodded slowly. The stubborn confidence that had carried him through the past week felt thinner now, stretched just as tight as the skin on the back of his neck. "I know," he said. He didn't say what he was thinking. That the shape of it scared him more than the pain. That it felt like something had taken hold beneath his skin and wasn't interested in leaving on its own. As he lay in bed that night, the ache pulsed steadily, deep and insistent. He stared into the dark, aware of the solid curve beneath his fingertips, aware of how long he'd waited. Some problems didn't fade when ignored. Some grew. It started with a complaint that sounded small. "Dad," Ethan said one afternoon, standing barefoot in the hallway, "my leg hurts." David looked up from the couch. "What kind of hurts?" Ethan shrugged. "It's sore." Sarah was the one who noticed how he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, how his hand hovered uncertainly near his thigh. She set down what she was holding and knelt in front of him. "Show me," she said. Ethan hesitated, then tugged at the hem of his shorts. On the inside of his thigh, just above the knee, was a small red bump. It wasn't large, not yet, but it was raised, firm enough to catch the light when Sarah tilted his legs slightly. Her heart dropped. "How long has that been there?" she asked. "Today," Ethan said. "I think." David leaned forward, squinting. "Probably a bug bite." Sarah didn't respond. She reached out and touched the skin around it gently. Ethan flinched. "That hurts," he said quickly. The area felt warm, too warm. "Did you scratch it?" she asked. "No," Ethan said. "It just started hurting." Sarah straightened slowly. A familiar sinking feeling settled in her chest. The same quiet alarm she'd felt days ago, now louder, harder to ignore. David tried to keep his voice light. "Kids get bumps all the time," but even as he said it, his eyes lingered on the spot longer than necessary. That night, Ethan complained again. The soreness had increased, and the small bump had become more defined, not wider but firmer, more present. When Sarah checked it before bed, she saw that the skin at the center had darkened slightly. She didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the bump looked worse. It had risen further, forming a tight, rounded swelling beneath the skin. Ethan winced when she helped him get dressed. I don't like it, he said, his voice small. Sarah forced a smile. We'll take care of it. David watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. The connection formed in Sarah's mind without effort. Shared towels, shared spaces, the way Ethan clung to his father, the way children always did, trusting closeness without question. What if it's just a coincidence? David said later, when she voiced her concern. Sarah turned to him slowly. What if it's not? He didn't answer. That afternoon, Sarah noticed something else. As she folded laundry, she felt a familiar stiffness in the fabric of one of David's shirts. Near the collar, a faint yellowish mark caught her eye. She held it up, breathing in cautiously. There was a subtle, unpleasant smell she hadn't noticed before. Her stomach tightened. When David came home that evening, Ethan met him at the door, then stopped short. Can you pick me up later? Ethan asked. My leg still hurts. David knelt instead, careful not to let his son press against his neck. He touched Ethan's shoulder gently. Hey, he said, we'll figure it out. Sarah watched the interaction, something breaking quietly inside her. That night, she checked Ethan again. The swelling was unmistakable now, small but firm, with a defined shape beneath the skin. It didn't behave like a rash or a bite. It held itself together, compact and contained, just like the one on David's neck. She sat on the edge of Ethan's bed after he fell asleep, staring at the bump in the dim glow of the nightlight. Children didn't choose habits, they inherited them. The next morning, Sarah found another problem. This time it was her own, a tenderness beneath her arm. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but when she pressed lightly she felt a familiar resistance, a small knot beneath the skin, not soft, not superficial. She closed her eyes. At breakfast, she set her coffee down untouched. David noticed. What's wrong? He asked. She met his eyes. I think I have one too. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. David's face drained of color. He looked from Sarah to Ethan, then instinctively reached back to his own neck. The solid curve was still there, unchanged, as if it had been waiting for this moment. No, he said quietly. That doesn't make sense. Sarah shook her head. It does. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since this had begun, there was no argument ready to fill the space. Ethan looked between them, confused. Am I in trouble? Sarah crossed the room and knelt in front of him, pulling him gently into her arms. No, sweetheart, she said. You didn't do anything wrong. She held him longer than usual, her eyes meeting David's over his son's head. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. It wasn't bad luck, or timing, or imagination. It was something moving through their household quietly, taking advantage of closeness, of familiarity, of trust. That night, David sat alone on the edge of the bed after Sarah and Ethan had fallen asleep. He reached back and touched the swelling on his neck again, tracing its hard, rounded shape. For the first time, the fear wasn't abstract. It had a face now, his son's, and it was impossible to ignore. The emergency room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. David sat rigidly in the chair, his hands clasped together, his shoulders hunched forward in a way that protected the back of his neck without him consciously realizing it. Ethan sat beside Sarah, swinging his legs slightly, quiet in a way that didn't fit his age. A nurse called David's name. They followed her down a narrow hallway into a curtained room. The lights were brighter there, unforgiving. David lowered himself onto the exam table, feeling the familiar pressure at the base of his neck as soon as he leaned back. The doctor entered a few minutes later. He was calm, efficient, the kind of man who had seen enough to no longer rush and no longer be easily surprised. What brings you in tonight? He asked. David started to answer, then stopped. Sarah spoke instead. He has a boil on the back of his neck, she said. It's been getting bigger. Our son has one now too. And I think I'm starting to get one. The doctor nodded once, already pulling on gloves. Can I take a look? He asked. David hesitated, then untied the towel he'd brought with him and lowered his head. The doctor stepped closer, examining the swelling carefully. He didn't poke at it immediately. He looked first at the size, the shape, the way the skin stretched over it. Then he pressed gently along the edges. David sucked in a breath. The doctor's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. He straightened slightly, eyes narrowing just a fraction as he felt the resistance beneath his fingers. "This is firm," he said. He pressed again, closer to the center. The swelling didn't compress, it didn't shift, it held its rounded shape, solid and contained. "This isn't superficial," the doctor said quietly. He stepped back and looked at David. "I'm going to ask you a few questions," he said. "Just answer honestly." David nodded. "Have you had any recent cuts or breaks in the skin around your neck?" the doctor asked. David hesitated. "I got a haircut last weekend." They cleaned up the neckline. The doctor nodded again, as if checking off an invisible box. "Did you try to squeeze or drain this yourself?" David glanced at Sarah, then back at the doctor. "Yes. How long ago?" "A few days." The doctor made a note on the chart. "Has anyone else in the household had similar skin problems recently?" he asked. Sarah answered immediately. "Our son. And now me." The room went quiet. The doctor stopped writing and looked up. His gaze moved from Sarah to Ethan, then back to David. "All right," he said. "That helps." David's heart began to pound. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm concerned about a resistant skin infection," the doctor replied evenly. "Possibly MRSA." The word landed heavily, unfamiliar and sharp. Sarah felt her chest tighten. "MRSA?" she repeated. "It's a type of staph bacteria that doesn't respond to many common antibiotics," the doctor explained. "It can spread through skin contact and shared items, towels, razors, bedding." David swallowed hard. The doctor gestured toward the swelling on David's neck. "The shape and firmness of this tells me it's deeper than a simple boil. It's likely an abscess that's walled itself off under the skin." He glanced at Ethan again. "When we see multiple family members with similar lesions, that raises a red flag." David stared at the floor. "I thought it was just a bump," he said quietly. The doctor nodded. "Most people do." He explained the next steps calmly. They would need to drain the abscess. They would take a sample for culture. David would likely need strong antibiotics, possibly intravenous depending on the results. Sarah and Ethan would need to be evaluated as well. "This isn't something to ignore," the doctor said. "But you came in when you needed to." David didn't feel relieved. As the nurse prepared the room for the procedure, David sat silently, replaying the past week in his mind. The haircut, the sting, the squeeze, the towels. The way Ethan hugged him without hesitation, none of it had felt dangerous at the time. The doctor returned, positioning himself behind David. "You're going to feel some pressure," he said. Pressure was an understatement. As the procedure began, David gripped the edge of the table, his jaw clenched. The sensation was deep and intense, not sharp, but overwhelming, as if something long trapped was finally being forced to move. Sarah turned away, holding Ethan close. When it was over, David felt strangely hollow, exhausted in a way he hadn't been before. The doctor stepped back, removing his gloves. "We'll know more once the lab results come back," he said. "But for now, we're treating this seriously." David nodded, unable to speak. For the first time since this had started, the problem had a name, and somehow that made it more frightening, not less. It didn't look exotic. It didn't come with dramatic symptoms at first. It didn't announce itself loudly. In fact, its most dangerous feature was how ordinary it appeared. The doctor explained it slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Staph bacteria lived on the skin of many healthy people," he said. "Most of the time, it caused no problems at all. It existed quietly, kept in check by intact skin and a functioning immune system. But when there was a break, a cut, a scrape, even a tiny nick from a razor, it could slip inside. MRSA was a version of that bacteria that had learned how to survive. Over time, exposure to antibiotics had forced it to adapt. The drugs that once stopped it no longer worked the way they should. It doesn't mean it's stronger," the doctor said. "It means it's harder to kill." David listened, his mind circling back to the moment in the barber shop, the brief sting, the way it hadn't seemed important enough to remember. The doctor went on. "When MRSA entered through the skin, it didn't always spread outward like a rash. Often it traveled deeper, settling into soft tissue where oxygen was lower and defenses were weaker. There, it could form an abscess, a pocket of infection sealed off by the body itself. That's why it felt hard," the doctor explained. Your body was trying to contain it. The image stayed with David. The swelling on his neck hadn't flattened because it wasn't meant to. It had grown upward instead of outward, building pressure beneath the skin, forming a rounded dome-like shape that resisted touch, like a shell. MRSA infections often behave that way, compact, contained, deceptively neat. The doctor explained why squeezing had made things worse. When pressure was applied to a deep abscess, bacteria could be forced into surrounding tissue or the bloodstream. What felt like an attempt to fix the problem could actually spread it. David felt a slow burn of shame rise in his chest. He thought about the towels, the way he'd wiped his neck without thinking, the way Ethan shared the same bathroom, the same space, the same habits. MRSA didn't need dirt or neglect. It needed opportunity. Skin-to-skin contact, shared fabrics, small, invisible transfers that no one noticed until they added up. In families, the doctor said, that opportunity was everywhere. That explained Ethan's leg, Sarah's tenderness under her arm, different locations, same pattern, warm, moist areas, places where skin rubbed against skin, places bacteria like to hide. David stared at his hands. What happens now? He asked. The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. MRSA could be treated, but it required precision. The right antibiotics, proper wound care, attention to hygiene that went beyond normal routines. In some cases, it meant isolation of personal items, separate towels, separate bedding, constant cleaning. It's manageable, the doctor said, but only if you take it seriously. David nodded slowly. He realized then how much of his confidence had been built on the idea that serious problems looked serious. That danger announced itself with intensity. MRSA challenged that belief completely. It looked like a bump. It felt like pressure. It behaved at first like something that would pass if ignored. That was how it spread. The lab results confirmed the suspicion the next day. MRSA positive. Sarah read the report twice before handing it to David. The letters felt heavier than the paper itself. Seeing the name made it real in a way nothing else had. David sat at the kitchen table, the document in front of him, his coffee untouched. He replayed every moment with a clarity that bordered on obsession. The choices that hadn't felt like choices at all. He understood now why the shape of the swelling had mattered so much. A soft pimple collapsed when pressed. A deep infection held its form. It resisted. It pushed upward, creating that unmistakable dome beneath the skin. When an infection grew that way, it wasn't going away on its own. The doctor had been clear about that. MRSA wasn't rare. It wasn't exotic. It lived in gyms, schools, locker rooms, households. It moved through ordinary life unnoticed, thriving in places where people assumed familiarity meant safety. David thought about how easily he'd dismissed Sarah's concern, how he'd trusted his instincts over her unease, how those instincts had been shaped by years of getting lucky. Luck, he realized, wasn't a strategy. That evening, Sarah began changing their routines. Towels were separated, bedding was washed in hot water, surfaces were wiped down carefully. Ethan watched from the doorway, confused and a little scared. "Are we sick?" he asked. "We're getting better," Sarah replied. David said nothing. He stood there, feeling the bandage at the back of his neck, the dull soreness where the pressure had finally been released. He understood something then that no one had ever explained to him before. The danger hadn't been the bacteria itself. The danger had been how normal everything felt while it was spreading. The procedure happened faster than David expected, and somehow that made it worse. There was no dramatic build-up, no long pause to prepare himself mentally. One moment he was sitting on the exam table, the next he was being told to lean forward and stay still. The nurse adjusted the light. The doctor spoke calmly, as if explaining something routine. "You're going to feel pressure," he said again. David braced himself. The first sensation wasn't pain but resistance, an intense awareness of something being forced where it didn't want to go. His hands tightened around the edge of the table as the pressure increased, deep and unrelenting, radiating outward from the base of his neck. Then came the pain, not sharp, not sudden. It was heavy, crushing, as if a deep internal tension was finally being disturbed. David sucked in a breath through clenched teeth, his jaw locking as his body reacted before his mind could catch up. Behind him, Sarah turned away, pressing Ethan's face into her shoulders so he wouldn't see. Ethan buried his head without understanding why, sensing only that something was wrong. David felt sweat bead along his forehead. As the doctor worked, the pressure shifted. Something released. The solid resistance he'd felt for days gave way slowly, reluctantly, as if whatever had been trapped beneath his skin had finally been forced out. The sensation was both relieving and disturbing. The tightness eased in increments, not all at once. The hard, rounded shape that had dominated the back of his neck for so long began to collapse inward, the dome losing its form. David felt lighter, strangely hollow, like a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying had suddenly disappeared. When it was over, he sagged slightly, his arms trembling. "All right," the doctor said. "That's done." David nodded, though he wasn't sure the doctor could see it. The area was cleaned and bandaged. The nurse explained the care instructions, her voice steady and practiced. David barely registered the words. He was focused on the absence of something, the pressure that was no longer there. He reached back carefully, touching the bandage. Flat. Not completely, but different enough to make his throat tighten. "I should have come in sooner," he said quietly. He was pale, his eyes unfocused, stripped of the confidence she'd seen him wear for weeks. She didn't say anything right away. David swallowed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have listened." The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth, not because he never apologized, but because this one carried weight. It wasn't about forgetting something or being impatient. It was about dismissing a warning that had mattered. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she hadn't allowed herself until now. She shook her head slowly. "I just didn't want it to get this far." "I know," David said. He meant more than that. He knew now how close they'd come to something worse, how his need to be right, to be self-sufficient, had put the people he loved in danger. As they left the hospital, David moved carefully, aware of every step, every turn of his head. The night air felt cool against his skin, the world strangely quiet after the sterile brightness inside. At home, Sarah helped Ethan get ready for bed. David stood in the hallway, watching his son disappear into his room, the image of the small swelling on Ethan's leg flashing in his mind. Later, when the house was still, David sat alone on the edge of the bed. He reached back again, fingers brushing the bandage, tracing the outline where the hard dome had once been. The shape that had scared him was gone. What remained was something heavier. He thought about how long he'd waited, how many times Sarah had asked him to take it seriously, how easily he'd brushed her off because the pain hadn't demanded his attention loudly enough. He understood now that strength wasn't ignoring discomfort. Sometimes strength was knowing when not to. David lay back carefully, staring at the ceiling. The ache in his neck was different now, cleaner, sharper, honest. A pain that meant healing had begun. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan's face when he'd asked if he was in trouble. He heard Sarah's quiet worry echoing in his head. For the first time since this had started, David wasn't afraid of what was happening to his body. He was afraid of what could have happened to his family. And that fear stayed with him long after the lights went out. Recovery didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in routines that had to be rebuilt piece by piece. The bacteria was being treated, but the household it had moved through was left altered in ways that weren't immediately visible. The first change was the towels. Sarah removed every one of them from the bathroom and carried them straight to the laundry room. She washed them separately, on the hottest setting, adding disinfectant the way the doctor had instructed. When she hung them back up, she labeled them without saying a word. One for her, one for David, one for Ethan. It felt excessive at first, then it felt necessary. Bedding followed. Sheets, pillowcases, blankets, everything went through cycles of hot water and heat. Sarah wiped down door handles, light switches, the bathroom counter, the edges of the sink. The house smelled faintly of cleaning solution for days. David watched all of it quietly. He moved more slowly now, careful with the bandage at the back of his neck. The area was tender, sore in a way that reminded him constantly of what had been there before. Each time Sarah changed the dressing, he caught a glimpse of the wound beneath, angry and raw, no longer hidden beneath that deceptive dome. The shape was gone. In its place was something more honest. Ethan's treatment began as well. The small swelling on his leg had to be monitored closely. Sarah sat with him during bandage changes, holding his hand while he squeezed his eyes shut. "Does it have to hurt?" he asked once, his voice trembling. Sarah swallowed. "Just a little," she said, "and then it'll feel better." David stood in the doorway, listening, his chest tight. Every flinch from his son felt like a reminder of his own delay. At night, the house felt different, quieter, not peaceful, cautious. The easy physical closeness they'd taken for granted had been replaced by careful movements and subtle distance. Hugs were shorter. Touch was more deliberate. David missed the way Ethan used to run into his arms without hesitation. He caught himself checking his son's skin more often than necessary, scanning for redness, for swelling, for any sign he might have missed. Sarah did the same. Their vigilance was quiet but constant. The scar on David's neck began to form. At first, it was angry and uneven, a jagged reminder of the incision. Over time, it flattened and faded slightly, but it never disappeared. When David ran his fingers over it, he could still feel where the skin dipped and thickened, where something had been opened that should never have needed to be. He avoided mirrors at first. When he finally looked, really looked, he barely recognized the man staring back. Not because of the scar itself, but because of what it represented. A line drawn between before and after. The doctor called with follow-up instructions, reminders about hygiene, warnings about recurrence. Miracé, he explained, had a way of lingering. It could come back if habits didn't change. David listened carefully. He threw away his old razor without hesitation. He bought new towels, new bedding, new cleaning supplies, small expenses that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to what they'd already paid. There were moments, quiet ones, when the weight of it all pressed in on him unexpectedly. Watching Sarah scrub the bathroom late at night, seeing Ethan hesitate before climbing onto his lap. Once, while folding laundry, David found himself holding a towel and freezing, memories rushing back of how casually he'd used it before. He set it down slowly, his hands trembling. Sarah noticed. She didn't say anything. She simply came over and squeezed his arm. That was enough. Life didn't return to normal. It adjusted. The fear didn't disappear either. It softened, becoming something more manageable, but it lingered in the background. A reminder that not all dangers announced themselves loudly, and that being careful wasn't the same as being weak. One evening, weeks later, David sat on the edge of the bed, his back to Sarah as she changed the bandage one last time. The wound had healed enough that it no longer needed daily care. "You're lucky," she said quietly. David nodded. "I know. Lucky that it had been caught when it was. Lucky that it hadn't spread further. Lucky that the cost, while heavy, hadn't been heavier." As Sarah taped the final dressing into place, David felt a strange mix of relief and regret settle over him. Healing was happening, but the lesson had already taken root. Some consequences didn't fade with the infection. They stayed, etched into memory, into routine, into the small choices that followed. David reached back once more, touching the scar. It wasn't painful anymore, but he knew he would never forget it. David stood in the bathroom long after the house had gone quiet. The mirror was fogged slightly from the shower, but he didn't wipe it away at first. He stood there, shoulders relaxed now, breathing evenly, letting the stillness settle. When he finally cleared the glass with the back of his hand, the man staring back at him looked familiar and changed. He turned his head slowly to the side. The scar sat just below his hairline, pale and thin now, no longer angry. It traced a subtle curve along the base of his neck, easy to miss unless you knew where to look. From the front, it barely showed. From behind, it caught the light at certain angles. A quiet line where something had once pushed its way up and refused to be ignored. Sarah appeared in the doorway without a sound. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She stepped closer, standing behind him, their reflections overlapping in the mirror. David felt her presence before he felt her hand rest gently on his shoulder. They stayed like that for a moment. The scar wasn't what bothered David most anymore. What stayed with him were the days before the hospital, the way everything had felt normal, the way the swelling had grown upward instead of outward, holding its shape like a hard dome beneath the skin, the way he'd convinced himself that because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't dangerous. He understood now how easy it was to get that wrong. Some problems didn't announce themselves with chaos. They grew quietly, fed by routine and familiarity. They looked manageable right up until they weren't. David thought about how many times people noticed something and waited. A bump, a soreness, a smell they couldn't quite place. How often those signs were explained away by heat, stress, bad sleep, bad luck. He thought about how close he'd come to waiting too long. If there was one thing the past weeks had taught him, it was this. When something didn't behave the way it should, that mattered. When a swelling didn't soften, when it didn't flatten, when it stayed firm, held its shape, and grew upward like something trapped beneath the skin, that was a warning. When pain felt deep instead of sharp, when heat lingered, when pressure built instead of releasing, those weren't signs to watch, they were signs to act. David turned slightly, meeting Sarah's eyes in the mirror. "If I ever ignore something like that again," he said quietly, "don't let me." She nodded. I won't. They had changed their routines now. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Towels stayed separate. Razors were personal. Small cuts were cleaned and covered without delay. When something didn't look right, they didn't wait for it to prove itself dangerous. They acted early. David had learned that there was a window, a narrow one, where action made all the difference. The first 24 hours mattered more than people realized. That was when you stopped squeezing, stopped sharing, stopped assuming. You watched closely and honestly. By 48 hours, if nothing improved, you didn't argue with yourself, you didn't negotiate, you asked for help. By 72 hours, you understood that waiting longer wasn't patience, it was risk. He wished someone had told him that before. In the weeks that followed, life settled into something quieter. Ethan healed, Sarah's tenderness faded, the house slowly regained its ease, though the lessons remained, woven into everyday habits. Sometimes when David hugged his son, he caught himself holding him just a little tighter, just a little more carefully. Ethan didn't notice. He only knew his father was there. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Ethan leaned his head against David's shoulder. David felt the familiar warmth, the uncomplicated trust. His throat tightened. He thought about how easily that trust could have been betrayed by inaction. Later that night, David returned to the bathroom alone and touched the scar one last time before bed. It wasn't painful, it wasn't ugly, it was simply there. A reminder, not of illness, but of responsibility. He understood now that the most frightening part of what had happened wasn't the hospital or the procedure or the diagnosis. It was how ordinary everything had felt while the danger was growing. He had worried about the cost of medical bills. What he hadn't considered was the cost of bringing something home, something invisible, persistent, and easily shared with the people he loved most. That was the part that stayed with him. As David turned off the light and walked back to the bedroom, he felt a calm he hadn't felt in weeks, not because the experience was behind him, but because he finally knew what to do if something like it ever appeared again. He would not wait for fear to justify action. He would not mistake familiarity for safety, because some scars weren't meant to be hidden, they were meant to be remembered.
Thank you for staying until the end with Return to Life. If you found a sense of connection or a small spark of hope, carry it with you as you return to everyday life. We look forward to seeing you in the stories ahead.